So we now have our final paper by Dr. Angus Mitchell, who is published extensively and internationally on Roger Casement, with a focus on South America. His books include the Amazon Journal of Roger Casement and Sir Roger Casement's documents. In 2020, he worked with the Brazilian director Aurelio Michels on a documentary film on resource wars and the extractive rubber industries. And today he's giving a paper on Voice of Reason, curating Roger Casement's colonial artifacts during the decade of centenaries.
Thank you for staying for the duration, and I would like to thank Brian, Ian, Lucy, and Emma, who I haven't actually met, but I've been trying to meet for about 20 years now, 15 for sure. So, Emma, if you're here, please do introduce yourself. This image is interesting, less for the statue of Casement and more for the juxtaposition with the Martello Tower. Because although I'm no Joyce scholar, I always think that that is where Stephen Dedalus tried to awake from the nightmare of history. And I think in many ways Casement is not necessarily a nightmare of history, but a nightmare for historians, which I think would appeal to Dominic. Anyway, to begin, in an examination of the entanglement of Ireland's relationship with the British Empire, few individuals generate in equal measure as much fascination and anxiety as Roger Casement. With his ancestral roots in Ulster, he is identified closely with this city and this province. His 20 years in Africa and 7 years in South America, serving in different colonial and consular roles, merged into his work for national organization. And that ended with his transgression into revolutionary resistance and his part in the founding and arming of the Irish Volunteers. His decampment to Germany in the autumn of 1914 led to his capture, trial, and execution for high treason. Casement's turn against empire is not easy to précis because for much of his life he apparently configured to the norms of imperial behavior. But actually Margaret O'Callaghan has written a very good article on Casement's relationship to both the British Foreign Office and empire. But that relationship with empire and his turn against it was a gradual process that occurred because of his exposure to what Dan Hicks describes as, quote, extractive militarist corporate colonialism, unquote. Experience of the contact zones of empire deepened his awareness of Ireland's colonial condition. His career as a consular officer configured with moments of extreme exploitation, the European invasion of sub-Saharan Africa and the landscape of violence underpinning the extractive rubber industry. Over the last 2 decades, awareness of Casement has coincided with various revealing public controversies over the politics of display and empire, and notably the renovation of the Africa Museum in Tervuren and the return of the Benin bronzes. One might have expected to see Casement discussed in recent calls to decolonize history in the archive, but his presence has been remarkably absent from all these conversations. One effect of his transgression into revolutionary resistance was to unsettle his labyrinthine archive. Casement understood the interdependent technologies of evidence and the archive and the interconnection with imperial systems and their knowledge formations. And in this regard, he might be analyzed in the light of Ariela Aisha Azolai's call for unlearning imperialism, through dismantling the structures of imperial sovereignty embedded in the interlinking technologies of the archive, museums, photographs, commemoration, historical practice, and human rights. In 1903, Casement began the process of handing over a considerable number of artifacts to different institutions in Ireland, and this process continued until his resignation from the Foreign Office in 1913. And these are the main repositories. The National Botanic Gardens has various economic botany specimens. The Natural History Museum have his famous collection of butterflies, which of course Rebecca Solnit has written about, the nest of a weaver bird, and the picture there of a rhinoceros viper. And then the Dublin Zoo actually received a lot of live animals from him, especially during his journeys into the Amazon. And the National Museum has 66 listed items in their archive. And then, of course, there's a cabinet of curiosities in the Casement family home near Ballycastle. In early correspondence, Casement referred to these items as curiosities and of no intrinsic value. But these objects map Casement's official career, from Liberia, the Oil Rivers Protectorate and Niger Coast Protectorate, through Swaziland, Portuguese East and West Africa, and the Congo Free State, and then after 1906 to Brazil and the Northwest Amazon bordering Peru and Colombia. Here are a few of those objects. Rachel showed the image on the top left-hand corner there of what is described as a fetish. And then there are some various other items there from both sub-Saharan Africa and the Amazon. It's significant that Casement began that process of handing these objects over when he returned from his main investigative voyages into the Upper Congo in 1903 and the Upper Amazon in 1910 and 11. And these material artifacts were collected and intended to supplement his official investigations. But it was very definitely intended that they should reside in Ireland and become part of, I suppose, a national story and consciousness. These objects are predominantly about the domestic and social sphere. They reflect Casement's interest in the arts and crafts movement and natural history. There are a few poisoned arrows, an axe and a dagger, but most artifacts were examples of the living environment, woven baskets, dance costumes, musical instruments, and items that spoke more to peace than war. And I suppose a way of comparing that is that's the studio of his great friend in Africa in early days, the sculptor Herbert Ward, who produced a number of bronze sculptures of Africans, mainly in sort of domestic situations, which were housed then at Tavoren. But Ward collected these very evidently sort of spears and instruments of war and defense in his studio, which Casement visited in 1910. But I think what's interesting there is that, you know, Casement's items are very different to those of Ward's. So the question might be asked, what was Casement's motivation in donating these objects to the National Museum? And what does it mean for Ireland to actually possess these artifacts? And I think there are probably different ways of actually answering those questions. But I think what Casement was increasingly conscious of, along with other cultural nationalist intellectuals involved in the preparation for independence, was the configuration of new coordinates for both a temporal and spatial sovereignty that was distinctly identifiable as Irish. His investigations situate this imagining within space-time coordinates that were based on values such as empathy, humanity, and non-violence. And a key constituent of this de-Anglicizing or de-imperializing process, decolonizing of Ireland, was to map alternative landscapes of memory and to advance counter-histories capable of challenging dominant narratives of imperial relations based in militarism and commerce. And I think in the light of Guy Byner's recent work on the 1798 rebellion in Antrim, it's reasonable to ask if Casement's bequest of these objects to the National Museum was intentionally laying the ground for pre-memory and or counter-memory, in other words, influencing the way he would be remembered through bequeathing objects to the nation in the making. Did he recognize in these objects embodied agency that might enable a specific type of access that would eventually be grounded in a consciousness framed by anti-colonial national independence? Anyway, was this new temporality that I'm speaking of, or was that specific temporality that I'm speaking of, reflected in the exhibitions about Casement curated during the decade of centenaries? So I want to now turn briefly to the four main exhibitions, but certainly not the only ones, about Casement of the last decade that sought to locate and explain his life. And I want to ask, how did these exhibitions validate the ideological landscape of the decade of centenaries, and did they operate to stabilize and reproduce certain narratives and to repress and diminish others? The first Casement exhibition was curated in 2010 and organized through the W.B. Yeats Chair in Irish Studies. It opened at the Maria Antonia Center at the University of Sao Paulo, and the exhibition was composed of a series of framed and sequential panels that explain through captioned photographs and maps the story of Casement's investigation into rubber extraction. And after Brazil, the panels traveled to Argentina, Peru, Madrid, Barcelona, the Amazon, and Ireland. And there you can see President Michael D. Higgins and Tornister with the Peruvian Minister of Foreign Affairs in Lima, looking at the exhibition. I think it's important to remind ourselves that Brazil is itself an imperial republic, and the profits from extractive rubber unleashed a scramble for new Amazon frontiers and the consolidation of its national borders in the late 19th century. And there were kind of hallucinatory scales of wealth generated through extractive rubber for a tiny coterie of what were essentially oligarchs or rubber barons. And of course, huge fortunes also made on the international stock exchange. On the reverse side of this modernizing moment was widespread invasion of unceded territory and the extreme exploitation of rainforest communities. And it is the case that untold millions died between sub-Saharan Africa and the Amazon. I mean, we know that many of us, I'm sure, are aware of Adam Hochschild's controversial claim that 10 million people in the Congo were essentially killed as a result of extractive rubber. No one's ever come to any kind of figure, agreed figure of what happened in the Amazon, but it's probably reaching towards that kind of figure. The outcome of this exhibition was the film Secrets from Putumayo, and I was involved in this in different ways in the research of the images. And I'd like to think that this is really very much an instrument of unlearning imperialism. It was directed by Aurelio Miquiles, who is a Brazilian filmmaker from the Amazon, and it was very much about indigenization. It was about getting the indigenous voices back into the narrative. So he went up into the area where these crimes against humanity had been committed and essentially gathered stories from the survivors. The next exhibition was put on in the Dublin City Gallery, the Hugh Lane, and this was called High Treason, and it ran from the spring to the autumn of 2016. The centerpiece of the exhibition was John Lavery's history painting placed in the context of his other portraits of those involved in the Anglo-Irish settlement. Supplementing the artworks were two films, Alan Gilson's 2002 documentary, The Ghost of Roger Casement, and Alan Phelan's Our Kind. Alan Phelan's an artist, which was he made this sort of counterfactual, iconoclastic fantasy where Casement survives the War of Independence and then bunkers down in some remote Norwegian fjord with his Nazi lover. Films and paintings were further supplemented by an oral opera by the avant-garde musician Gavin Friday, a cycle of lectures, and an illustrated catalogue. And through this cacophony of mixed images and mixed messages, this exhibition decoupled Casement from his work in Africa and South America and blocked explanation of his revolutionary logic by aestheticizing his trial. A more straightforward biographical exhibition, Casement in Kerry, A Revolutionary Journey, curated by Helen O'Carroll at the Kerry County Museum, tried to alleviate a legacy of trauma in Kerry around Casement's capture on Banner Strand and the tragic backstories of the Kerry witnesses deployed at his trial. The exhibition opened on the 21st of April 2016 after President Higgins's oration on Banner Strand. A pop-up version of this exhibition was then taken by the Department of Foreign Affairs and exhibited in Abuja in Nigeria and in Edinburgh. And there you see Sean Hoy, the ambassador in Nigeria, with the director of the museum there. With the exhibition panels. And then there is on the right the image of objects from the National Museum that were part of that exhibition. And then the final exhibition I'm going to look at was Fiona Riley's curation at the National Museum of a display in a side gallery in Leinster House. And it was a very kind of moving display in many ways. Roger Casement, the voice of the voiceless. The exhibition opened on the 3rd of August 2016 and ran until 2019. A substantial number of those objects bequeathed by Casement and mentioned earlier were displayed as art objects. Captions were both in Irish and English, and the exhibits were framed around Casement's contribution to contemporary human rights, field reporting, and humanitarian advocacy. The intent here was to contextualize Casement's within Ireland's long involvement with humanitarian action. A prominent mention was made of contemporary non-governmental organizations, notably Anti-Slavery International and Survival International. There was, however, no effort to contextualize the artifacts within indigenous forms of knowledge. So what do these different curatorial responses tell us about Ireland's relationship to imperial display, history, and commemoration? Well, I think each of these exhibitions in different ways mirrored imperial temporality and specific colonial frames of knowledge, especially with respect to the material artifacts held in the National Museum. Casement is unrecognized as an anti-colonial nationalist who deployed the language of humanitarianism to challenge empire, but rather as an exemplar of the good imperialist and the imperial humanitarian. Explanations of his logical transformation into an enemy of empire were effaced and blocked. Each of these exhibitions adopted different narrative frames that conformed to timelines, differentials, and geographies of empire. Thereby, they anchored Ireland within specifically contemporary global coordinates, such as Ireland's campaign seeking election to the UN Security Council, the humanitarian impulse and human rights discourse, underscoring much Irish foreign policy. There was limited reflection on why Casement had deposited these objects in Ireland in the first place, and no one asked, to whom do these objects actually belong? The empire whose servant collected them, Ireland's national repositories where they were deposited and are preserved, or those communities whose cosmologies they embody. And this question of belonging is one that needs to be conceptually unpacked. And I think it's useful to make reference to the cultural theory of Wayne Modest on how to rethink relationships between objects and their ownership, and how this might awaken what he terms a space of care for those parts of the earth from which the objects were stolen. And he means, by care, he means here care for humanity, and not care in terms of preservation. So to finish up, Casement placed on the record a trail of evidence that described an exposed empire and its military, commercial, and extractive articulations. If we accept that the archive is the, quote, institution through which the imperial condition is maintained, then this is why his presence endures to haunt and unsettle the present. In his essay scrutinizing ritual, identity, and nation, and the place of the historian in commemorative practice, Dominic Bryan argues that, quote, the professional historian plays a legitimizing role in the commemorative practice by endorsing what are acts of political identity. And actually, when I picked that quote out, I had no idea Dominic was actually going to be speaking today, so I was very happy about that. At least I got one thing right. Brian's argument might be extended to the field of curatorial practice, and I think, I mean, when I was listening in also to what Dominic was saying this morning, I thought, gosh, this really does also apply to those exhibitions in different ways, because the curating and staging of the temporary exhibition marking the decade of centenaries has facilitated the conversion of the violence of imperial action into acknowledged realities. The collection of artifacts donated by Casement to the National Museum were not gifts or curiosities, but spoils of war. Casement was part of the colonial bureaucracy of imperial invasion of late 19th century empire, but he emerged as one of its fiercest critics and channeled his anti-imperialism through Irish nationalism. In 1910, his analysis of the commercial regime on the Amazon frontier unequivocally condemned both international finance and the white colonial man as constitutive of criminal exploitation that reached back to 1492. Through his critique, he overturned the colonial hierarchy, identifying the Amerindians as the agents of moral order, physically and mentally superior to the profit-driven white male colonist. And while there are elements of the noble savage in that view, there is also an outlook that is struggling to be post-colonial. The artifacts collected by Casement possess a means to unlearn imperialism and create what the Senegalese philosopher Souleymane Bachir Diagne describes as a new relational ethics. Each object metaphysically embodies an entire philosophy that is defined through the knowledge systems, languages, and customary law of those communities devastated by the extractive resource wars. This metaphysical dynamic might be mobilized to turn the objects into ambassadors for a new diplomacy of display. Such redress would allow curators and ethnographers to work with source communities and speak to contemporary concerns on reparations, restorative justice, and restitution. It is not enough to assert the provenance of these objects as a bequest from Roger Casement, as if this is sufficient to legitimize their possession.